Right, so I'm led to believe that the traditional way to start a talk of this kind is to, remark on what a privilege it is to speak in front of a group like this in such a beautiful room, and that's all very true, but I'd actually like to start by making a complaint to the organisers of this event for putting me after Andy Duncan's excellent speech just then. I'm doomed to disappoint you all with whatever this is, but the flip side of that is I do have the slot before lunch, so if you notice it flagging a little bit, just go ahead and open the door, and hopefully the food smells wafting in will distract everyone. We're also running amazingly a little bit ahead of time, almost 10 minutes ahead, but I'll graciously decline to take up that extra 10 minutes with my talk. We can all have a nice 2.5-hour executive lunch break after this. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about today is what can this organisation, the Ludwig von Mises Centre here in the UK, learn from that brilliant organisation that shares our namesake and many of the same ideas across the Atlantic, of course, Ludwig von Mises Institute over in the US. And I think this is an important thing to really spell out explicitly here, not only because we're so early in the lifespan of this institution as it exists today, the Ludwig von Mises Centre here, but also because even aside from the namesake, even aside from the shared ideas and all that, what the Mises Institute in the States has achieved with the resources, the limited resources it has available to it, is incredibly impressive regardless of those shared ideas and so on and so forth. So, just to list off a few of the most immediately obvious examples, the way they publish all of these great works of Austrian economics and libertarianism, speaking as someone who's been through the sort of college libertarian circles fairly recently, anyone you talk to who's grown up and come to these ideas in the age of the internet will cite that as one of the absolute key things that has steered them in this direction, publishing by the Mises Institute. They've also provided a sort of academic nucleus for this movement to congeal around with their fellowship program and with the two sort of great scholarly journals they have over there, the QJAE and the Journal of Libertarian Studies, and also through their programs, student courses and things like that. Like obviously the most famous one is the Mises University program they have there every summer. They have, at this point, I think those have been going on for over 30 years now. At this point, thousands of students have been through these programs, learning the great insights of Austrian economics. And the interesting thing about that is now they have people who've been through Mises University now in every level of government in the US. The Mises Institute isn't even trying to get people into government directly, but they're still managing it. I'm led to believe there are a couple of Mises U graduates actually working in the White House at the moment, which is quite something if you're not even trying for it. So I think that's sort of sums up why, even aside from the namesake and all that, there are some real lessons to learn here, especially given how they've accomplished all that with fairly meager resources. I'm not trying to insult them, but they're also not one of these sort of tens of millions of dollar budgets, beltway libertarian think tanks, which have accomplished even less. So I was a little bit trepidatious when it came to talking on this subject, because a lot of the things I'm going to be putting out are fairly sort of common sense insights, which many of us could have come to, if we thought about it. And that's good for me, of course, because it brings it down to my own intellectual level. But even despite that, I think these things do bear saying at this sort of nascent stage in this organization. By having these things in the forefront of our mind, common sense as they may be, we can sort of encode them in the DNA of this organization going forward. So hopefully we'll remain on the right track. So who am I to be standing up here and claiming to be an expert in these common sense things, if that's not a contradiction in term? Well, aside from having been through the Mises Institute in the US fellowship program last year, I think my one sort of credential for giving this talk is that I may well be the most flag-waving, card-carrying, tub-thumping, frothing at the mouth Mises Institute fanboy on the planet. And the interesting thing about that is that my enthusiasm for this organization is not purely a result of my own bizarre personality. This is actually something you can hear a surprising number of people saying. You hear you never hear someone saying, oh, the Center for Policy Research changed my life. You never hear about other organizations of a similar kind, but you do hear people saying about the Mises Institute. So, Tom Woods quite often says, oh, maybe the person I am today and all this sort of stuff. And it doesn't hurt to reflect on why that is. It's a very unusual phenomenon. And sort of starting with one of the most obvious and hopefully, working our way down to slightly more sort of interesting things. The most obvious reason why that would be the case is obviously the extraordinary sort of purity of the message that they've been able to maintain over the years. They haven't been sort of watering it down or offering a sanitized version of these ideas of Austrian economics and liberty. They tend to stick to these things in their absolute purest distillation, which is part of the reason why it has such an attraction for people, especially for people who are coming to these ideas recently. You can sort of go to them as the ideological true north of the entire movement. You sort of set your own opinions and you have that as a benchmark to sort of think about things, which is part of the reason why I think they wield such a tremendous influence, especially with people who are just maybe young people sort of coming to these ideas. It's a very valuable thing to have that. It also, the fact that they have such a sort of clear ideological or, economic idea of what their core message is, allows them in a funny sort of way to use their limited resources much more effectively and efficiently than they otherwise might be able to. So there's a tendency with organizations like this that don't have such a clear and precise message to become self-perpetuating. They exist for the sake of paying their employees and so on and so forth. You will never see, some Mises Institute, chairman or whoever it might be riding around in a limousine like you would see with some of these other big, Washington think tanks and so on and so forth. It allows you to stick to that message and use those resources much more effectively if you have that sort of purity in what you're trying to put forth. Okay, that's a fairly elementary thing. Yes, we can all see that they have very pure message. What's interesting is why that might be. The factors sort of playing into their ability to keep that going throughout the years. No one goes into being in an economics institute or a think tank or whatever with the intention of watering down their ideas. So there must be some reason why most people do it. And I think the main one is most of these organizations are getting directly involved with politics, whereas that's something that the Mises Institute obviously steers very clear of, and it's something we could certainly bear to copy, where they're not out there drafting policy papers or making policy recommendations and so on and so forth, and it gives them the liberty to offer this unsanitized, very radical message that has had so many beneficial effects, both in terms of their efficiency and in terms of keeping the message pure. Like, for example, the other day I saw a tweet from someone associated with one of these libertarian think tanks here in London, and they were saying, looking forward to going off to this conference that I'm speaking at today so that I can talk about the big issues of the time, universal basic income and hospital car park charges. Oh yeah, you're really going to change the world with those two things. And it comes from this desire to be politically appealing and to be broadly appealing. We don't need to convince 51% of the people in this country of our ideas so that we can get a paper across the floor of the House of Commons. That's not what this should be for, and it's certainly not what the Mises Institute is for. Now that I think about it, I think that guy who sent that tweet was the Adam Smith Institute that said it, and as we've said, I guess the Adam Smith Institute isn't really a libertarian think tank anymore. They're neoliberal now. Of course, anyone with even marginal powers of perception who's been following the Adam Smith Institute for any length of time will realize they haven't offered a decent libertarian policy proposal in quite some time. But, of course, I suppose that rests on the assumption that anyone follows the Adam Smith Institute without bringing with them an IQ that doubles as their shoe size, but that's beside the point. As much as I might make fun of these people, they're not bad people, and they may even have good ideas, but it's this obsession with sort of spreading the message to 51% of the population that leads them into this watering down of their ideas. Another one that I see from a lot of these competing think tanks in this country that really irks me is their cringe-worthy attempts to appeal to young people. Okay, I'm sure some of you have seen the sort of thing I'm talking about. And it's not to say we shouldn't be trying to appeal to young people. I mean, if only for the reason that a younger person is more likely to completely change their opinions about the way the world works than someone who's already set in their ways and so on and so forth. That's all fine. But there's a certain way of going after young people that it wouldn't hurt us to avoid, and that the Mises Institute has been very deft in avoiding, just by offering these great ideas. They tend to attract people spontaneously without really needing to try for in this particularly cringe-worthy way. So like another tweet I saw, I suppose you're getting the impression that I spend quite a lot of my time on Twitter laughing at these other libertarian think tanks, which is true. But this was again from the Adam Smith Institute, and I don't know who's in charge of their social media service, but they tweeted out, let us know how you feel about universal basic income in 3 emojis or less. And so once I pulled myself off the floor from the full body cringe that induced in me, being a good millennial, I did respond with the 3 emojis that universal basic income brought to mind. I think I used the frowny face emoji, the thumbs down emoji, and the always effective hammer and sickle emojis. They were no longer in any doubt about how I feel about that. But this whole way of appealing to young people is completely juvenile. And I won't go on about it at too much length, because I've got a feeling that this is something we'll be able to avoid fairly easily. I mean, our brilliant chairman, Keir Markland, I mean, this guy's barely onto solid foods, and he's already a brilliant sort of exponent of these ideas, a great intellect, and correct me if I'm wrong, Keir, I don't think he became that way by waking up one day and seeing a right-wing think tank sharing a funny meme on the internet. So that's something that the Mises Institute has been very good in avoiding. They do attract young people very easily, but it's just by going back to this very pure message that they have and that they're able to put across. Another interesting thing, and this is another one that we may be able to avoid falling into this trap quite easily, is trying not to become reliant on a single multi-millionaire donor or anything like that. Now, I don't know if we've got Richard Branson hammering down the door out there or anything like that. Perhaps this won't be too difficult to follow this guideline, but that's something that you see. You know, one of the unique things about the Mises Institute out in the States is that it's one of the organizations in this sort of ideological sphere that isn't heavily funded by the Koch brothers. As many people know, the Mises Institute relies on many small donors, and that's allowed them to avoid some of the vitriol that comes from, you know, people on the left when they make these other organizations make any sort of claim about policy or whatever. They're met with, oh, well, you know, you're just funded by the Koch brothers, or it's practically become an in-joke online whenever anyone from the Institute of Economic Affairs says anything online, as good as that organization may be on certain things. They're immediately just inundated with, oh, well, who funds the IEA? Who funds the IEA? And invalid as those sorts of ideas may be, it's nevertheless a sort of roadblock that we could easily avoid if we follow this example from the Mises. And in fact, it's interesting. I was always under the impression that this was an explicit intentional policy of the Mises Institute out in the States, as I hope it should be for us, to intentionally avoid becoming, you know, attached to some massive donor. But I actually heard Lou Rockwell tell the story the other day about how when he was just starting up the Mises Institute, just over 35 years ago, he was good friends with someone who was in charge of the Koch Foundation, or who was some, you know, big player in the Koch Foundation at the time. And so he said to them, you know, I wonder if there's any possibility that the Koch brothers would see fit to, you know, provide some funding to this organization I'm starting up, the Ludwig von Mises Institute. And not only did they come back and say, no, we're not going to fund you, they came back and demanded that he not even start the Mises Institute to begin with, because the Koch brothers, they're all in favor of, they thought, you know, Milton Friedman, that's the way to go, that should be the future economic direction of this movement. They weren't interested in the Mises Institute at all. They wanted to shut out the influence of Mises and Rothbard from, you know, sort of the public discourse 35 years ago. So, I mean, it illustrates how many strings can come attached to that sort of arrangement. And finally, one of the other things I wanted to say is it's a little bit more intangible to put your finger on this particular aspect of how the Mises Institute in the States puts its message across, but I think it's something we should certainly aim to achieve. They have this infectious positivity when they're putting across these ideas. Many of them, are very personally optimistic people, funny and so on and so forth. And it does have a big impact, especially if you're, coming to these ideas as a younger person. You might be watching some of these lectures and learning about it online and so on and so forth. It makes it much more attractive to become attracted into this sort of economic sphere. So for example, when I was coming to these ideas a few years ago, I'd be online watching lectures from, Tom Woods or Walter Block or Bob Murphy or even Murray Rothbard. These are all very naturally funny people, and they put across their message very optimistically, and it makes it much more attractive to learn about these things. I'd be watching and I think, you told 2 jokes in that lecture, I guess I'll reciprocate by going and reading a 900-page economics treatise, because cause and effect, that's how my mind works at least. But this might be a fairly obvious point, but it's particularly important for this organisation. Okay, this is a right libertarian organisation comprised of people mainly from Britain, okay? We're in dire danger of turning into the curmudgeon party. As Keir mentioned, there's a lot out there to be curmudgeonly about. This country is not in a good state by any stretch of the imagination. Plenty of things to be grumbling and complaining about, but that's a repellent way to put across the message, if you see what I mean. It's something we should be very conscious of avoiding, because I'm sure that would be a very easy sort of thing to fall into. So, fortunately, I'm finishing a little bit early here, so you're going to be able to enjoy a 2 3/4 hour executive lunch break here. But, in conclusion, it's true that, on the face of it, you might look at this country and say all hope is lost. This country is in a very bad state politically, and the idea that we're going to be able to build Rome in a day and all this sort of stuff, especially given the foundation we're having to start on, is a pretty dubious proposition indeed. But I don't think there is sort of no hope or anything like that, and I think the gathering of people here today does some small part to prove that. We have good foundations here for this organisation to really make a difference. This is, the country that, since at least the Levellers in the English Civil War, we've had this sort of spirit of classical liberalism, I suppose you could call it, immanent in the national character, and it went on through John Locke and through the 19th century and so on and so forth. And over the last 100 years, we've seen that decline to a very great extent. You might almost think that it's completely absent now, but I do think that still exists. And like I said, I think this organisation, if we follow some of these basic ideas and these basic strategies that have been so successful for the Mises Institute in the States in putting our message across and in forming this sort of centre point for people with these sorts of ideas in this country, then we may yet be successful in rekindling some of these ideas that almost seem to have been lost. Thank you.